Hi everyone, welcome to episode 2 of the World Simulation Engine development. This is a development that's going to be a base to creating the Martian Worlds game, which is kind of like a proof of concept game. May turn into something even bigger later. So basically what we have now is a conservation of momentum and kinetic energy. So we actually have the particles colliding with each other, and currently it is using an elastic force equation. There's an inelastic force equation as well, which I'll probably interpolate between them based on some sort of state. These are actual particles taken from the periodic table. Again, if you watch the previous video, you will see me talk about it a bit more as well. You'll hear me talk about the periodic table in the previous video a bit more, just to give you a brief update. I just pulled some of the data in, mainly as a proof of concept. I may not even keep this, but it seems to solve most of the properties that I'm looking for, and it's the only one I found that has color defaulted in here. So I'm actually able to pull the color for the elements. It saves me a lot of time. I may actually go through and repurpose a lot of this data. I may just extract some properties and maybe put it in a completely different format, because a lot of this stuff I actually don't need. I've been pulling a lot of stuff out to the elements class, and this is being read by this method, and then basically elements are being created and set as these properties. So in the end, when you actually go to reference a property, you basically just have to go to the namespace, hit a period, and there you go. The IntelliSense will pop up all the different particles. Now I'll probably add in some special fancy schmancy particles and whatever that you can put in here, and magic particles, whatever, that you can do some cool things with. But for now, I wanted to have some base foundation to start with. I have iron, copper, tin, mercury, and you'll see the different colors when the page actually refreshes. If we go ahead and refresh the page here, you'll see it pop up here. Then we got the different colors, and you can already see the the force of them hitting each other. And let me go ahead and refresh the page again. If I hold a key here on the keyboard, when the particles hit off, they can actually split off. And so there's the particles. They're hitting off each other. It might not be as easy to see it because they're so small. But one thing we can definitely try doing instead is to increase the size. I can actually change the pixel sizes. So I have the pixel sizes set to 8 currently. So let's go ahead and make, I don't know, how big do we want to make it? 64, make it very predominant, stand out. The system is designed to be very customizable. Everything that is meaningful to the dimensions of the simulation can be set. And right away we can see, oh, that might be a bit too large. Let's go ahead and refresh, maybe add some more particles in here. See if this helps at all. And you can see how the particles are kind of hitting into each other, never occupying the same space, as matter shouldn't. So basically what happens is that you have an object that's here, moving this way, and an object that's here, moving this way. And so when they do eventually collide, when that one object sort of moves here, and then when I get to this object, and it goes to move into this position, it sees, oh, there's a grid here, and in this particular grid location there's an object. And given the fact that now if this velocity of course was greater in this direction, even though it's about to jump into this block, it'll know that it's okay, because basically this one's going faster and it's not really colliding. So it has to be that it's a slower velocity, right, or it's coming in this direction, and it'll actually determine that it's actually supposed to hit each other. And it takes all this stuff into account. If you notice that I drew circles inside of these squares, because there are actually particles flying through, even though I have a 64 by 64 block, what's actually happening is that you actually have 64 vertical or 64 horizontal pixels that particle can travel through before it gets to the next grid square. So what I'm doing is I'm actually painting the grid squares where the particles are based on the cell sizes. So you could call this a layer, and this layer and the cell size of the layer is 64 by 64 right now. Now, the way I have it set up currently Most systems, let me go ahead and get a new screen here. Most systems have a grid. So you have 0, 0, right? It starts here, and then you have this grid, and then basically you have these, cells created from a fixed grid width, and it's got a width, and it's got, some sort of, height, and that's it. That's the number of cells you got. You get past this, you delete objects, they're gone, right? And that's it. You can't go outside this boundary. Now, I didn't like to have that kind of constraint, so I'm trying something new. So, because the objects are focused on like a Cartesian plane where 0 is the center, right? Now, normally the block would be here. So what I'm actually doing is centering the block right on the center. So 0, 0 is actually the center of the object by default. So the center of all of these blocks would actually be an origin straight from the center of this plane, right? And so then basically you have a grid that builds out from that, and the grid is basically off from the center. Now, in order to know if an object collides with another object, you don't want to test every single object to see if every object is within a certain grid cell. So what I have is I have a very fast system that uses the current grid location and stores an object there, a reference to it. So if any other object, when it calculates its positional change, follows a grid cell that has another object in it, it knows that it needs to check to see if it collided. Did it collide? Did it not collide? That's the only time it needs to check. I mean, if it's not in the cell, then it doesn't need to check. It can't go faster than a cell. So if I have a cell, I can't have a particle that's going to jump across another one into a third block. That's not possible. It's actually capped at only going as far as one grid cell width or height. And so what happens in this case is that it is capped. So if you were to try to make it go faster, it will actually stop the speed from going any faster than that. Which is why in the physics updates you can actually call it many times. So if you call a based on velocity, if it's going here, and then you call the update function again, it goes here, and you call the update function again, and it goes here, and every time you call the update function, it goes in certain iterations, but it never goes past a block size. That way it can always, at the fastest speed it can basically go from, every time you make a call to the update physics function, it can go from one block to the next block, one at a time. So one full jump is the fastest it can go. And if you're going 60 frames per second, that is pretty fast in itself. So in essence, you could actually have something that's here, and then you call update, and it's here, and then you call update again, and it's over here, but that's the same time it actually draws the frame, and then you'll see that it looks like it jumped from this pixel to this pixel, but it actually did process this one as well, because you didn't see that in between. So the actual rendering happens. And so this is a common lot of game loops, and where the physics is kind of has a separate loop from the actual visual drawing. So you can also throttle that in case you want to adjust things to increase speeds for anything. Now there's no prediction. I'm not going to have pixels where there's a vector and it crosses with another vector, and I'm not getting into all that kind of math, because I don't want to do any kind of predictive stuff where I have to decide that something collided, so I have to go back and get another vector and all this stuff, and it was too much, right? Especially don't want to be doing things with circles and trying to get the point of collision between them, and then having them fly off in whatever direction, right? And I don't want to do that. So I want to keep things as simple as possible. We're trying to get speed here, and that's great. And the cool thing about this is that the way this is designed is that if I actually have two blocks beside each other and one block comes in and hits the side here, this block will actually fly off and this one won't move, right? Because it'll actually transfer the speed across between it, using, again, elastic collisions. Kind of like when you have the pendulum ball coming down and hitting another ball. So this one hits this one, and when it does, this ball then suddenly flies out here, right? And then this one now is down here, and then they bounce back and forth. You remember those? Same kind of thing. And if you notice, all the ones in the center don't move. It's just the one that hits the side and over here, and then this one bounces off, and these don't move. And these don't move here in the center, right? So it just transfers the energy across, and then the one that's at the end doesn't have any other ball after it, so it just takes off and flies up. And of course, because it's on a pivot point, it flies upwards, and then gravity pulls it back down. Gravity causes it to hit the side, and it comes up again. And so you've seen some of those toys. So, but that's the elastic collision. The inelastic collision, if that was the case, when this ball came down and hit this ball, they would all start moving. If they somehow, maybe these were magnets, then if these were magnets and this came down and hit this one, and it wasn't enough force to shoot this away because of the magnetic field would keep them glued together, they would just move in unison. And what will happen is the speed of this coming down will be distributed across the mass of all the objects. And there's some very neat YouTube videos on this kind of stuff. There's lots of them, showing you examples and experiments on this type of stuff. But remember, in collision, there's inelastic and elastic collisions. And so right now this is doing an elastic collision. Well, let's go ahead and change this to maybe, oops, wrong one, 32. Let's change this one so it's not so big. There you have it. There you go. So just in the moment it goes in, and based on its velocity and the velocity of the particles traveling on and the magnitude of that velocity, it determines that, hey, these objects are colliding, and then it calls it on collision event that then determines, okay, based on their direction and their masses and their velocities, it determines how the objects will rebound from one another. So that's pretty much it for the most part. That's again, these are just particles, demo particles currently. I can actually go here and tweak a few things. I had this mass up to 10. Let's go ahead and modify this, and maybe we'll go ahead and modify this, bring it back to 1. So we keep all the proper masses. I was actually playing with it before to inflate the masses, which you can do. And there you have it. You have, I believe it's iron and tin and copper flying around and interacting each other. The tin was thrown off. I guess it's because it's got a lower mass compared to the others. So when the others hit the tin, it just went flying. And because the mass of tin is kind of low, it probably there wasn't enough gravitational force to keep it in when it got hit. Now, if I hold down 2 keys on the keyboard, I can have these guys spitting off each other. There we have all kinds of these different masses flying into each other. Now, you may notice that it's kind of slow. This is mainly because the debugger is attached, so it is slow. It is kind of at this speed you can kind of see, how they're interacting and bouncing off each other and sliding around and so on and so forth. The gravity is trying to pull them into the center, but they're just kind of colliding into each other. And now, no two matter particles can occupy the same grid space, so it basically will force the object back into its previous space and then calculate velocity changes and causing that force to be pushed across from one to the next. Now, this can go much faster. We go ahead and terminate the debugger by basically starting the performance analyzer. It actually disconnects the debugger because I have Visual Studio open, obviously. So let's go ahead and do that, and there you go. So I can actually have a lot more objects on the screen, of course. And also the frame rate will drop as the objects are being added. And when I let go, it does speed up slightly. And when I push it down, it will speed up again. And there you have it. So you can see a lot of objects clustered right in the center. Now again, I touched on this before. I have an array that goes one array into the positive x and one array into the negative x. I have another array for each x coordinate on either side. I have an array that goes up and an array that goes down for each spot. And for every y on that x, the array increases up or down. So there's one array if it's negative, one array if it's positive. That basically means that as the objects go through the system, it sort of creates an entry of arrays along x and then puts itself in an entry in that array. And so it grows out in all 4 directions. If you were to envision this as a Cartesian plane where in the center is 0 and up is positive y, currently, mimicking the three-dimensional engines that usually have y is up. I'm going to keep that same idea. I want to try to mimic three-dimensional concepts in a two-dimensional space. There will be layers. This is a layer that's currently rendering, but we'll have like maybe water and gas in the front and some other background objects in the back and so on and so forth. There's a whole lot more optimizations that can be done here that I haven't done in the engine, and we're already basically at 20 frames, getting close to 500 here. Actually, let's just bring it to 500 even. There we go. Well, close enough. So as you can see, that's still pretty good. I've had this up to about 1,000, and at 1,000 it goes to about 10 frames per second for 1,000 objects, all calculating gravitational forces and collisions and everything of every single, well, not every single particle, just the colliding ones in real time. So it's actually running pretty fast. But this can probably almost double this frame rate once I put in some other optimizations. I have created my own inline compiler that will actually flatten the JavaScript and compile certain inherited methods down into a flat method. I've actually been surprised that the nested calls of the functions in the graph tree actually doesn't is actually quite well optimized. I guess through the JIT compiler. However way it does it, there's not as much of a cost as there used to be in calling functions these days. There's still a bit of a cost, but I do have ways to, and actually have tested that I can actually pull out an extra 2, 3, 4 frames per second based on these optimizations and whatnot. Now, I've been turned off for the development process. It wasn't enough to warrant turning them on, but if I did turn them on, I could probably jump that FPS back up to 23, 24. And that's not even, again, fully optimized. There's a lot of other areas where I can even push it, and that would probably jump up back up to like 30, 40, just at this level. Again, I've seen some people render, 50,000, 100,000 objects. But remember, there's physics going on here too. There's physics calculations, and in this physics calculations includes, distance equations and square roots and stuff like that. So it's actually pretty good, given how many calculations are involved, especially when they're colliding. And there's all kinds of calculations involved for the momentum and force and so on and so forth. So, and there you have it. So that's the main thing in a nutshell. Now let's go ahead and give Chrome a try. Now let's see what Chrome does. See how fast it goes. Let's refresh it again. Hold down the control buttons. Have the particles split, and we'll see what kind of a speed we can get in Chrome. So we saw about 20 frames per second in IE, and I think I tested this before. You can get a whole lot more particles. I find that the Chrome browser is very well optimized. I guess using the V8 engine was actually quite impressive in its speed. And let's go ahead and bring this up to 500 and see what kind of frame rate we get. Oh, there we go. So already you can see we're at 22, 23. So it's actually a little bit faster. I believe we had just close to, we had maybe an average of 20 in the other browser. So if we were to go to IE, right, and then try the same thing, again, side by side, at 500, and let's see what happens. Okay, so what we have here now is IE running at close to around 500. Sorry, I went over a little bit. And we got 13 frames per second. Now we switch back to Chrome. We can see that it's at 26. So if we were to put these side by side, there you have it for the particle engine. They're actually just off by one object count. IE falls behind at 13.4, and Chrome is at 25, 26, 27, 20, oh, it keeps going up, 28. Anyway, so it seems to be averaging at about 26, 27 frames per second. You can see right away that Chrome is definitely faster in crunching through all the algebra required for getting this thing up and running. So if you remember from the previous video, we have different particles of matter that we can put together. Each particle is basically matter, which can be composed of various elements. Right? So we have all the elements here from the periodic table, and there's a bunch more as well that are in there. So here I'm creating a particle of water. When I say particle, think of like molecules. So I can compose a molecule on the screen of different elements. Now, in the future, I might have some like magic elements that do some like silly things, or special logic or programming behind it. But for now, I'm just keeping true to the elements themselves, just for simplicity's sake. Each one of these have their atomic weights and so on and so forth. As I showed before, here's the table with all the information, and then it's all imported. And so what we can do here is also set a color to track this. So red, green, blue. So I put blue to FF. So maximize the blue. So it stands out. And you can see that it's water and compared to the others. So let's go ahead and run this. You should see a blue block that is now water. So it's combined masses of 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen. And there you have it. So there's our blue water. And there's iron and copper and a bunch of other stuff. But you can see the mass of the water molecule is not big as some of the others. So the mass of the other objects are just smacking that water molecule around. We just get us all kinds of particles in here. See if we can't just multiply these. Or multiplying some water particles too. But you notice that the water particles don't want to stay in the center. And that's kind of expected. Don't worry about the slow frame rate. That's simply because I'm in debug mode. But you notice how the heavier particles are pushing out the weaker particles because more gravitational force towards the center. These particles are rebounding off each other and causing various chain reactions. But let's go ahead and remove that debugger. Let's increase the speed here a bit more. There we go. So if you actually run the profiler, it disconnects the debugger. There we go. Because it's connected to Visual Studio. So there we have it. Let's go ahead and add in a few more in here. And you can see, there you go. So let's go ahead and refresh this, and then I'm going to hold down these keys again. See if we can't get more of these water particles being created. And you notice how a few of them got created and got trapped in the center, but I just can't seem to get those water molecules trapped in the center, nor should I, because any light molecules will be driven out by the more dense ones. And there you have it. Now, of course, we could take this a step further, and I could say, okay, let's take this water molecule, and we'll take its mass, and we're going to make it. We're going to actually let's multiply it by say 10 times. So here we have mass times 10, so 10 times the water mass. So let's go ahead and give that a try. And there you have it. And because the density is now increased compared to the other particles, if the molecules are basically heavier, then you'll see this happen. Now, of course, this doesn't take any sort of viscosities or anything else into effect. I mean, perhaps if you had that amount of water molecules in that area, it would just simply, pass through it, so to speak, in some way, because it's not as tightly bound together as a molecule of metal. But nonetheless, the way the system is treated is that no two particles can occupy the same space. So when it does hit it, it just treats it as a mass object, not any sort of type of object, just a mass object. It doesn't know that water is, is not metal, and doesn't know that metal is not water. So it's just saying this is a solid object of a particular mass. So this other information I'll probably build in here as well and program into the system as we kind of go along. I'm not going to try to simulate real life with any of this. Now, if I was to instead just multiply the water by 2, got it again, give it another look, and we can see it's stronger than it was originally, but it's still pretty weak compared to the others. But let's see, it's hard to tell when there's not a lot of them, so let's go ahead and see if we can't get more of these multiplying. As soon as the heavier particles started coming in here, you can see right away it just started driving it out. Let's go ahead and detach the debugger. And there you have it. So let's go ahead and refresh this and see if I can't hold down the control and get some more of these things multiplying. So there you go. You get a bit more water mixing into it because the mass is a little closer, right? So let's try to multiply the mass by 3. Let's just pick it up a notch. Now it's going to get probably closer to a comparable mass of some larger elements that are more metallic. There you have it. So let's go ahead and multiply some more of these. And there we go. So we got an interesting close balance now between water and some of the other elements, as you can see here. Again, because if the masses are closer to the other objects, they won't be rebounded as much. So you'll see them mix because of the mass of water being pushed into a small molecule. So let's go ahead and just put it back to the way it was. So again, as you can see, back to its original state, H2O by itself still is not enough mass to contend with the metallic particles. So as I increase the particles, you'll see that it pretty much just drives the water out. The H2O molecule is not dense enough to fly into here, and so all it takes is a little bit of copper or iron or anything else to just hit that water molecule and drive it straight out the screen. Now these are large blocks, of course. I can make these blocks much smaller. Let's go ahead and make it smaller. And we're going to go ahead and make it maybe 4x4 pixel size block, and so that way it's much smaller and you can fit more into the screen. There you have it. So let's go ahead and increase some of these, and they look more like actual particles now. So it almost looks like electrons. Let's go ahead and increase the amount of particles we have going on here. At this magnitude, we can actually see the water particles that were driven out the screen that we couldn't see the last time. You can see how the water molecules are kind of bouncing around the outside of the screen, which wasn't as obvious before because the denser particles in the center with a greater mass hit against the water particles. And because the water particles have very low mass in comparison, it doesn't take much. So based on momentum and force, when they hit and the equation is triggered, of course it will translate into a lot of force being translated into the water molecule being hit. So you can basically see it's like the water molecules are like hitting a brick wall almost and just like rebounding off completely with a lot of force. Because don't forget, if it's not just hitting a stationary object. So if a heavy object is moving and hits another object moving towards it and it's got perfect elasticity, then the elastic equations just reverse the velocity of the water molecule, but also add the velocity of the weightier particle to it as well. Now, the water molecules are not being destroyed. There's nothing being destroyed here. But it's pretty apparent that all the violent interactions of the weightier particles have driven the water straight out of the screen. So anyways, this brings us to the conclusion. Just wanted to kind of show you guys the physics of the particles now, which is kind of cool. We can optimize this to bring this number up much higher as well. We will have world object sprites that we compose the blocks of these, where they won't be animated individually like this. So I mean, this will only occur where you might have like puddles and other water particles and stuff that's in the earth. But if you were to like chip away or shoot at some block that was composed of these particles, then that pre-rendered cached bitmap of those blocks might chip off that corner and that particle might go somewhere. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it and figure out a few things, but it's coming along. As I said before in the first video, I was going to work on the collisions, and here it is. So hopefully by the next video I can iron out some more of the performance and pull up this number even higher. So I already know after running a profiler where some of the bottlenecks are, and so we'll have that all cleaned up. Well, that's it, everyone. Thanks for watching the video. I appreciate your time following me on this journey for building this simulator / game. And by all means, please subscribe, stay tuned, and see how I'm able to make this more efficient and increase the object count and keep the frame rate high as well. There we go. Cheers.